This is the history of Kingsburg and the history of Concordia Lutheran Church. No problem. Let's start at the very beginning. 19th century Sweden. Now I know that with the Swedish festival is just 25 days away, this might seem to be a rather insensitive remark, but 19th century Sweden was not a smorgasbord and a parade. Remember, 1.3 million Swedes fled for America. 1/4 of the population left Sweden. Why? The population had doubled and there was no land. There was no way to obtain land, and 40% of Swedish farmland was unfarmable, as rocky, barren, and uncaring as, let's just say it here, the snobbish Swedish ruling class. The state church was a mouthpiece for the Stockholm elites and warned from the pulpit that this immigration thing was just a craze. Those who left Sweden for America could be slaughtered by savage Indians and lose their faith in a foreign culture. Then it gets worse. A great famine came upon Sweden. Crops failed, mines closed, economy shattered. And you can appreciate how those beleaguered Swedes developed a reputation for being cautious and skeptical. So let's go to America. In America, you can vote even if you didn't own property. In America, there was religious freedom. You could become a Methodist or even a Baptist without being fined or banished from the village. Swedes hated slavery and loved Abraham Lincoln. Let's go to America and vote Republican. But perhaps biggest of all, America was the land of the Homestead Act. Millions of acres of federal land, yours for the taking at $1.25 an acre. And we don't have to cross the Atlantic in the steerage of a sailboat barge, where for 3 months you might battle lice, maggots, typhus. We can take the cool new steamships. Only a 10-day crossing and steerage is cheap, and you could ride a ship that was hauling iron to New York and cross the Atlantic for $12. So, they grabbed their Swedish psalm books and their Luther catechisms, and these cautious and skeptical Swedes take a great leap of faith. They leave. They leave by the tens of thousands. Most of them were rural and young. 22-year-old Andrew Eriksson leaves Sweden. Carl Johnson, 18 years old, leaves. Peter Hero, Big Charlie Carlson, Noak Anderson. Stockholm was the largest Swedish-speaking city in the world, but by the turn of the century, the second largest Swedish-speaking city in the world was Chicago. And in America, young Swedish farm girls become the most desired of all domestic servants, the Swedish maid. The Swedes plow the fields all across the upper Midwest, and they dot the landscape with Lutheran churches, and occasionally Mission Covenant, Baptist, and Methodist churches. It's hard work. Everyone was happy. Well, as happy as a Swede could muster. Everyone happy except for one unfortunate group of Swedes who wound up working the mines in a freezing, God-forsaken place in a town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan called Ishpeming. Of course, those were our people. And they complained that the Ishpeming winters were too long, too lonely, too cold, and too much like Sweden. They didn't want to work in the mines. They wanted to be farmers, and they had a new dream, California. So they held meetings. They decided to all chip in money and to finance one person to go on a scouting trip through California. One man was chosen, one man they trusted, one man they had faith would make a decision for all of their lives. And they chose a machinist in his 20s named Andrew Eriksson. And he was directed to tour the entire state and to find good land that they could homestead. Whatever his decision, they would accept. So Andrew Eriksson arrives in San Francisco. And the first thing he is told is that all of the homestead land in California is gone. Too late. It's 1886. The gold rush is over. So he meets with the Reverend Joseph Twain of Ebenezer Church of San Francisco, the first Augustana Lutheran church in California. And the Reverend Twain suggests that he travel down the coast all the way to Southern California and then return north through Central Valley. Andrew gets as far as San Jose when, to his amazement, he spots a familiar face from Ishpeming, Carl Johnson. And Carl Johnson tells Andrew Erickson that he came out to visit his cousin Frank, who used to live in New York City and then San Francisco, but now has bought land out in the middle of nowhere in the valley where he's trying to grow fruit trees. And we are the only two Swedes there, and it's so lonely. Check it out before you decide. It gets hot. Ishpeming will love it. So, at this time, the most famous author and personality in America was Mark Twain. And Mark Twain had a nephew named Samuel Moffett, who graduated from Harvard, explored California, bought land in, of all places, Kingsburg, and became the director of the Centerville-Kingsburg Canal. Water, as usual, meant war. Samuel Moffett bought dynamite sticks when someone built an illegal dam and tried to divert his canal water. He debated water rights and from Kingsburg wrote articles about water that were published in New York magazines like Harper's Weekly. This caught the attention of William Randolph Hearst, who hired him to move to San Francisco and write for the Examiner. So Moffett sold his Kingsburg property to his urban, educated Swedish friend, Frank Rosendahl, who lived in Easton. And that is how Mark Twain's nephew brought the first Swede to Kingsburg. Frank Rosendahl was Kingsburg's first Swede. His cousin, Carl Johnson from Ishpeming, was the second. And I'm sure you guessed that Andrew Erickson did visit them, and ultimately, Erickson becomes the most influential person in the Swedish migration to Kingsburg as he brings an entire community with him. Andrew Erickson is our colonist, and word gets out to Swedes across the Midwest that a Swedish farm town was developing in the center of the state. And this was an easy sell in Ishpeming. Erickson told them that Kingsburg had good land, a nearby river, irrigation canals. There already were two Swedes there, and one of them was our own Carl Johnson. He also told them that he had met a Mr. A.A. Smith, Kingsburg's first realtor, and today the namesake of Smith Street. And if the group came out, Smith would sell them good property and as a bonus would give them a parcel of land that they could build a church on. Plus, you could take the train there. The Santa Fe Railroad had finally reached California, and it broke the monopoly of the hated Southern Pacific and created a price war for passenger rail tickets. At one point in 1886, you could ride from St. Louis to California for $1. So this was a deal that those Swedes would expect for the rest of their lives. In 1886, Kingsburg was barely 14 years old. Think about this. Before the railroad arrived in 1872, there was no Kingsburg, no Selma, no Fresno, just open land that was turf for the Tachi Indians, Spanish explorers, Kit Carson, Mexican land grants, and finally cattle barons. And to the south was the old cow town called Visalia. And to the north was the Fort Miller community, which today lies at the bottom of Millerton Lake. And the old Butterfield stage line connected Visalia to the south and Fort Miller to the north. And there was nothing in between. Nothing in between but one store, one stop called Kingston, which was across the river from what today is Layton. Josiah Draper lived in Kingston, where he had a livery business. And hearing that a railroad is coming, Draper understood immediately that the stagecoach town of Kingston would die and completely disappear, which it did. And this new rail stop was the future. So he acquires property next to the stop and gets hired by the railroad to lay out the town. Josiah Draper is the father of Kingsburg, and he never met a Swede. He died 3 years before the Swedes arrived. There were no crops, just cattle. Then, state legislation is passed that favors farmers over cattlemen, and everything becomes wheat. Locals jokingly call the settlement Drapersville. The railroad calls it Kings River Switch. The first post office is called Wheatville, until finally it's all Kingsburg. And what did early Kingsburg look like? An 1873 visit by one of the biggest bad boy celebrities in California gives us a stark description. The notorious Mexican bandit Tiburcio Vasquez and his gang. Vasquez was educated, spoke Spanish and English, loved women and poetry, hated gringos, was a cattle thief and bandito who loved to hogtie his victims. And a year after his Kingsburg visit, he was convicted in San Jose of murder in which was the O.J.-style media circus trial of the 1870s, in which his female admirers came to visit him in jail and he sold autographs to friends for money. On the gallows, he said just one word to his hangman, pronto. Vasquez is the inspiration for the fictional character Zorro. And when his gang descended on Kingsburg, there was only one store on one side of the track, and on the other, no depot yet, just a simple rail platform and a tiny rail office shack. And the one store was run by White Davies, his wife, his sons, Samuel, and Solomon. Yes, Kingsburg's pioneer first merchants were Jews. Austrian Jews from Virginia, fun fact. And when Vasquez and company rode in, a day after robbing and hog-tying the entire town of Kingston, the quick-thinking family whipped out cans of meats and oysters, sardines, crackers, a real deli spread, plus, of course, whiskey and cigars. Vasquez loved it, decided not to rob them, rode off without even looking at the railroad shack, which was nervously hiding a $10,000 gold shipment for a cattle baron. So at a time when up and down the state, everyone was jittery that Vasquez was behind every bush, in Kingsburg, our pioneer Jewish merchants saved the day and outfoxed Zorro. That's good. I love that story. Anyway, in 1886, just weeks before our Ishpeming Swedes arrived, there was a gun battle on the streets of Kingsburg between a hot-headed Traver cowboy, Constable Pete Simpson, and his deputy. The deputy is shot in the mouth. The outlaw takes a bullet in the lungs, and Simpson prevails and ultimately has a street named after him. Sometimes unsavory characters from Traver would cause big trouble in Kingsburg. But Traver in the late 1880s was a very big deal. The year our families arrive, 32 million pounds of wheat are shipped out of Traver and loaded onto 3,000 rail boxcars. Traver had exploded as a seamy boomtown, several times the size of Kingsburg, with a bustling core of hotels, merchants, a Chinatown, several body houses, and 14 saloons where high rollers tossed dice at $200 a shake. 2 years later, alkali destroys the land, the railroad expands and develops other shipping centers, and Traver dies almost as quickly as it had boomed, nearly becoming a ghost town. Traver and Kingsburg become a tale of two cities of incredible contrast. The day after Thanksgiving, 1886, the first 4 Ishpeming Swedes step off the train and onto the Kingsburg rail platform and stare at their new hometown of about 100 residents. They are Andrew Erickson and his family, Peter Hero and family, Big Charlie Carlson, and Carl Berg. They see dusty streets and wooden sidewalks. Most of the businesses are on Front Street, today called Simpson. There are 2 saloons, not 14 like Traver, a barber shop, 3 merchandise stores, a couple of livery stables, and hotels. And looking at the wooden buildings, they spot an occasional bullet hole. One local character, John Forney, who used to debate water with Samuel Moffett and raise chickens in town, steps out of a saloon and is mystified by the odd-looking strangers standing on the railroad platform. "Who's that?" he asks his buddy. And his equally friend replies, "They're Swedes." The first 4 get to work, and with a horse and plow begin the backbreaking work of farming. Wheat is over, now it's fruit trees and muscat vines. They gather in homes with their Swedish Bibles to worship and pray and never lose sight of their goal, to form a church. Others arrive. Sally Hagmark talked about how she was so glad to leave the freezing snow that she threw out her overboots out of the train window, exclaiming that she would never need them again. But arriving in Kingsburg, she was shocked to see that the streets were all mud. Andrew Erickson remains in touch with the Reverend Twain of San Francisco, who comes down to meet. And on a Tuesday evening, September 6, 1887, in the home of Carl Johnson, officiated by our founding pastor, Reverend Twain, 11 adults and 5 children gather to form the very first Lutheran church in the San Joaquin Valley, and the 5th Lutheran church in the state of California. The Reverend Twain suggests adding the name Concordia, which meaning unity, and the full name becomes Concordia Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church, but for many years it's simply called the Swedish Lutheran Church. Today, 130 years later, Carl Johnson's house still stands, added onto and converted to an office complex, 1340 Sierra Street. In 1923, the house was purchased by Peter Rudholm, who raised a large Lutheran family, some of Concordia's most faithful servants, and today it is owned by our own David Stone. If you were to approach New Era Financing, you will see a plaque next to the door honoring it as the birthplace of Concordia Lutheran Church. And if you peeked inside, you would be entering into what used to be Carl Johnson's dining room and the adjacent parlor where the Reverend Twain officiated the first meeting. A retired Lutheran minister, Reverend Anderson, who was just visiting, gets corralled into becoming the first pastor for about 6 months. The little congregation meets in a hall on Simpson Street. There is a fire. There is no fire department or waterworks. It burns to the ground. So it's back to home meetings, but a lesson is learned. They are going to build their own church, and it must be brick. So 1 year after founding the church, in Carl Johnson's home, across the street from Carl Johnson's, in that triangle of land donated by A.A. Smith, bordered by Sierra, Lincoln, and Ellis, which now houses the New Life Ministry, the congregation, still only about 20 people, built this. And in 1888, there had never been a structure that looked like this in Kingsburg, with its clean red brick fired from a brickyard near the Kings River south of town. It resembled something from Sweden. Its tower was the tallest structure in town, and locals proudly marveled at its simple beauty that set a new tone for the town and seemed to assert that this is who we are. This is what we want this town to become, and it's not Traver. But the interior was totally bare. No pulpit, no altar, no pews. People sat on wooden planks laid on nail kegs. Throughout the 1890s, the pastor wrote that everyone was as poor as night owls who sought a home in our church tower. Farmers struggled. It takes years to get a crop. They were broke. Many were destitute, and stated that if it wasn't for the carp in the Kings River, they would have starved to death. When Noack Anderson, a foreman at the Ishpeming mines, and his wife, Laura, first saw the land that they had bought, it appeared so dry and barren that she initially refused to unpack her suitcase. Carl Berg left for a couple of years to take a job building the San Francisco cable cars. Banks were foreclosing on mortgages, and the church's debt was as tall as its famous tower. There was no pastor for over 5 years, and laymen led the service, reading printed sermons. But from the very beginning, coming to the aid were the church's women, and they called themselves Syföreningen, the Swedish word for sewing society. They sewed and sold items, and they would use the money to reduce the debt. Despite these hardships, they loved music and managed to acquire a small pump organ. And across town, performing under kerosene lamps in a little grove on Simpson, the Kingsburg City Band was formed the same year as Concordia. And its first band director, Lars Klaus, no surprise, was also Concordia's first music director. And every parcel of land along Sierra Street was owned by someone from Ishpeming. Down toward the railroad tracks was the Erickson property. Where Memorial Park is today was Peter Hero's ranch. Later, for $70, Hero sold a piece of it to the Swedish Baptists to build their church on. Tulare Street was then called Ishpeming Avenue. Where we gather tonight used to be the Anderson Ranch. And across the street where the church is was owned by the Carlson brothers. Big Charlie Carlson built his home on what today is 21st Street, and known for his feats of strength and too cheap to hire a wagon, he carried the lumber for his house by hand all the way from the railroad tracks to 21st Street. All of this land was Ishpeming, was Lutheran, and was sold by A.A. Smith, who was a Methodist. And his little church, the old Methodist South, was actually 3 years older than Concordia and was Kingsburg's first church, located down on the west end of Draper near where Capps and Roosevelt School are. The only surviving evidence of it is that the cross street is still called Church Street. It was Kingsburg's only pre-Swede church, and as the town, now overrun by foreign-tongued immigrants, rose to 6 churches and 500 people, it was the only church in town where you could hear a sermon in English. Concordia gained prestige as the site of the very first Augustana, California conference, ultimately celebrated being debt-free by burning its mortgage on the altar at a special New Year's Eve service, reached a membership level of 100, and in 1902 installed a massive bell, the first church bell in Kingsburg. Swedes in town increasingly became the leaders of a growing, passionate prohibition movement. Seeking the power to close saloons and halt liquor sales, they decide to incorporate as a city. They also sold their grapes to the wineries. And the large Italian-Swiss Colony Winery sat just blocks from the center of town. Finally, the winery's property was excluded from the proposed city limits. And after months of pulpit pounding, anti-saloon rallies, and even a Save Our Children parade, only about 100 people vote. Remember, it's 1908. Women have no vote. So 34 men were opposed, arguing that cityhood was just a new layer of taxes. But overwhelmingly, with 72 male votes, the city of Kingsburg was born. And in short order, concrete sidewalks were poured, complete with hitching posts for horses. The town's kerosene street lamps were replaced by blazing 150-watt electrical bulbs. Our mighty baseball team, the Kingsburg Speed Boys, is forced to relocate its ballpark because a 60,000-gallon, 122-foot-tall water tower is being built right on top of its outfield. And in a 2-room schoolhouse at the corner of 18th and Riverside, Kingsburg High School celebrates its very first graduating class, a class of 4 Swedish girls, including our own Katie Hero. And they, I think this is your cue, and they composed a cheer. Okay, everybody, let's stand. We need a little, all righty, this is you. All right. Start by just raise your hand up and say, yeah! All right, okay. Necka bread and sill. Necka bread and sill. Villa Valla Ville. Villa Valla Ville. Kingsburg High School. Kingsburg High School. Oh, vi till. Oh, vi till. Vem is the bästa? Vem is the bästa? Vi are the bästa. Vi are the bästa. Yeah! All right, wonderful. Okay. Okay. We are almost home. You guys are so good. Okay. All right, now the year is 1916. By 1916, the city of Kingsburg was known as the city of churches, had grown to over 1,000 people, and 94% of all homes within a 3-mile radius of town were Swedish. World War I is raging in Europe. 16 Concordia members serve in the military, and Concordia's membership had grown to 225. Concordia decides to take another leap of faith, to build a larger church on the corner where the Carlson orchard is, that would be directly across the street from the Anderson Ranch, where this jaw-dropping new high school is coming up. The earnest young pastor is the Reverend Martin Odell, whose grandson Dick Swenson is sitting here amongst us tonight. And Kingsburg's mayor was none other than our own Andrew Erickson. Erickson, our colonist and church founder, was a lifetime leader for both Concordia and the city of Kingsburg. And with his thick Swedish accent, he served 20 terms on the city council and 3 terms as mayor. And so, after 29 years of housing Kingsburg's first Swedish church, the brick building on the triangle with the tall tower is sold, and its services are in a new language, Armenian. Carl Johnson, Kingsburg's second Swede, had sold land to Kingsburg's first Armenian, whose name was Aslan. The Sephardians and the Moravians, fleeing the Muslim Turks who by decree of the Sultan were slaughtering Christian Armenians, were soon to follow. And now Concordia's first home becomes the Armenian Martyrs Presbyterian Church. The building was demolished in 1951 and replaced. The bell survives today because in 1917, though almost forgotten, it had been moved to the newer church, and it remains the oldest church bell in Kingsburg. The intersection of 18th and Sierra is set to become Kingsburg's architecturally iconic focal point. The new high school is not a romanticized vision of old Sweden. It's a romanticized vision of their new land, California. And as much as we cringe about this today, it is well known that there were pockets of anti-Catholicism locally, and some tried to keep the Catholic Church from coming to town. So, it was a tad ironic that the big new high school looked like the Santa Barbara Mission. This Spanish colonial beauty seemed to be designed by Zorro, and with its arcaded corridors, faux bell towers, and red-tiled roof, you half expected to bump into a gentle padre. But with a sly wink and to history, it could have been called Tiburcio Vasquez High. And after school, our first students would cross the magnificent Spanish facade as they walked home to speak with the old folks in Swedish. Across the street from the high school, Spanish Colonial met the other architectural rage of the day, Gothic Revival. Concordia hired Kingsburg's foremost architect, builder Anton Johnson, whose work will be highlighted at this year's Swedish festival, to build a new Gothic-style church. The budget was a whopping $12,000, but even with some volunteer labor and that the majestic stained glass windows were being donated as memorials, the cost rose to $19,000. Gothic is the style of the great medieval cathedrals, but later during Renaissance was derided as overly ornate and vulgar. But in 1917 America, Gothic Revival was in full flower. Its proponents called it the official Christian architecture. It was ecclesiastical, traditional, and its soaring vertical lines, spires, pointed arches, vaulted ceilings, massive windows made a powerful statement. The balcony stained glass windows above the front doors were a gift of Laura Anderson, a memorial for her husband Noak, a strong man and accomplished swimmer who, possibly due to a cramp or seizure, drowned in the Kings River. He had lived in Kingsburg only 7 years. Laura and Noak moved to Kingsburg because they feared that the Ishpeming mines were not a safe environment for their family. Sadly, in Kingsburg, she lost her young husband Noak to a drowning, and later, her oldest son Aaron in a dynamite accident. The north windows face the Anderson Ranch, which is now the high school. The house was actually just right out this door, where the math building is now. As she desired, Laura could always see the stained glass windows from her house. Noak and Laura Anderson's great-grandson is Grant Anderson, a director of the Larry Hillblom Foundation. And 5 years ago, the foundation donated $170,000 to repair and restore Concordia's famed stained glass windows. Also, one of Grant's grandmothers was little Esther Hero, who as a little girl, 5 years old, rode that first train of 4 Ishpeming Swedes with her parents. And she was in the room at 6 years old at Concordia's first meeting at Carl Johnson's house. And at 25, the year she married Noah Anderson's son, Andrew, she went to a church raffle and won the friendship quilt, which is on display tonight. That same year, the new church was dedicated through a member gift. Concordia attempted something that no other Kingsburg church has done. It operated its own retirement home, Fern Home, Concordia Home, for about a dozen years. Concordia was a community of worker bees. It had a board of deacons and a board of trustees, Sunday school staff since 1889, a choir since 1907. The original 1887 Seafordian, whatever, were now called the more pronounceable Ladies' Aid Society. And a young ladies' version was called Linnea. These ladies, in June of 1924, on the lawns of our retirement home, held the first community midsummer festival, which today is the forerunner of today's Kingsburg Swedish festival. There was no CYT, there was Luther League. And the men's group was the mighty Concordia Brotherhood. Because Augustana Sided firmly believed that any church that only looked after its own needs was spiritually dead, there was a women's missionary society, and then there was a junior women's missionary society, which was also known as the Glow Girls. And in the 1930s, the Glow Girls specifically focused on ministering to the physical needs of, quote, the strangers at our door, meaning the hundreds of migrant fruit pickers who came every year. Years later, all these women's groups would unite and then form circles. The interior of Concordia, though basically the same, has had 4 different looks, each representing the ever-swinging pendulum of taste. Initially, the sanctuary's pulpit, baptismal font, all had ornate Gothic detail. But the main attraction facing the congregation was the 2 massive murals of Jesus on each side of the chancel. The focal point of the altar was not a cross, but it was a statue of Jesus. And that statue is standing on this side of the room tonight. This look lasted for about 15 years. Lasted for 30 years, I'm sorry. In the 1940s, Professor August Wildemar Anderson, a former music department head from a Midwestern Lutheran university, was Concordia's music director and lobbied for a massive Moeller organ installation. The Jesus murals were demolished to make room for a giant pipe organ chambers. The Jesus statue is moved to the narthex. Concordia has gained a mighty sound, and its interior becomes darker and more formal. This lasted about 15 years. As mid-century modern churches with their clean lines and bright colors were appearing across the nation, Concordia's interior seemed dark, rigid, and cold. In 1962, the dark wooden theater seats were replaced with blonde pews. The dark wood paneling was painted over in creamy white, and there was a new modern streamlined pulpit with no Gothic excess. A floor-to-ceiling turquoise drape was hung behind the altar, matching the turquoise carpet and turquoise choir robes. And in front of the drape, the focal point of the altar was a giant, glistening gold cross. And the message was clear. God's love is bright, direct, and accessible. And the pastor at the 1962 dedication exhorted the congregation to, quote, throw off our pious and conservative cloak and rededicate our house of worship to the glory of God. And the high-flying congregation claimed Concordia's peak membership of 400, which included 100 children who filled all 8 of the Sunday school classrooms. Generally, during the majority of the 20th century decades, Concordia's membership hovered in the mid-300 range. This remodel, which also spurred the building of the fireside room, lasted about 45 years. Our current, very elegant remodel tosses out the turquoise, dials back the blonde, humbles the cross from gold to wood, and reintroduces Gothic elements and takes a more traditional and conservative pose. Each remodel succeeds in its own era, and each provides a fascinating snapshot of what's going on with the congregation. But our changes in decor pale in comparison to the changes throughout town. Consider this. Today in Kingsburg, there is no ELCA, there is no Methodist church, no Presbyterian church, no beautiful Spanish colonial high school. And today's high school kids, after school, walk home and speak to the old folks in Spanish. In a town that was invented to close saloons, high school kids grab a burger for lunch at the bar and grill across from the Baptist church. The town's major retailers are no longer on Draper. The winery is now Save Mart, the cotton oil is Walgreens, the cannery will be the new Grace Church of the Valley, and I fear that the culture of the Del Monte Cannery is so ingrained in the DNA of Kingsburg that people will attend Grace Church all summer and expect an unemployment check the rest of the year. Next door to the new Grace Church is the Holy Family Catholic Church, which sits on the site of what used to be Kingsburg's second Swedish church, the long-forgotten, demolished 80 years ago, Swedish Methodist Episcopal Church, which was Frank Rosendal's church. Holy Family Church sits on land purchased by one of its own members because in the 1940s, no one in Kingsburg would sell property to the Catholic Church. Today, Holy Family Catholic Church and its future neighbor, Grace Church of the Valley, each have memberships trending towards 700. And today, they are Kingsburg's two largest churches. And they're next-door neighbors. And one church refuses to join the Kingsburg Ministerial Union because the other church is allowed to be a member. Today, fortunately, at the corner of 18th and Sierra, Kingsburg's dear friend, that elegant, stately Gothic old lady, Concordia, survives and stands 100 years proud. Today's membership has diminished by a third from 50 years ago, mirroring church memberships across today's America. But on the bright side, not as bad as Sweden. Oddly enough, at about 225 members, Concordia's size today is identical to what it was 100 years ago when our sanctuary was under construction. I would like to close on a personal note. For my family, Concordia is very personal. My mom, Bernice, a dancing Dane from Easton who has always blessed the day that she married a Swede named Christenson, moved to Kingsburg, and joined Concordia. My folks loved the gracious people of Concordia and fully embraced the Concordia life. She, the tall Sunday school teacher with the big hair, and he, the board member who took the job very seriously, but often revealed a very sharp sense of humor. One dark October night at age 47, my dad collapsed and died of a heart attack while working in the vineyard. They were starting to clear the field of muscat stumps in order to plant Thompson seedless. A couple of days later, one of the church's new members asked my shell-shocked mom what kind of help we needed. And as the women of Concordia had showered my mom with love, without telling us, without any fanfare, a gathering of Concordia men went out to the field and finished the job. One of them was a teenage Lena Shalene, who I believe was promised donuts. To us, this was a physical manifestation of Christ's love. It was the best of what a community and what a church could be. A church is a community of people, and whether they pray in Swedish, Armenian, English, or Spanish, whatever the size of the congregation or the color of the carpet, tonight we honor the hundreds of Concordia faces that we remember dearly, who worshiped with us, prayed for us, taught us a Sunday school lesson, greeted us at the door, brought a casserole, gave us a ride, cleaned the kitchen, offered so many forms of kindness. So God's blessings to you people here tonight. You tonight are the living legacy of what 11 adults and 5 children started September 6, 1887, in a little home just blocks from here. You and the Kingsburg City Band are the same age, and at 130 years old are Kingsburg's 2 oldest organizations, 21 years older than the city itself. You are the longest running church in the history of Kingsburg. You are the history of Kingsburg. You are the oldest Lutheran church in the entire San Joaquin Valley. On behalf of the committees, God bless Kingsburg, God bless Concordia, and thank you all for coming tonight. Okay. All righty.